the romantic investment in uh, activating, mobilizing marginal voices, recognizing formerly silenced perspectives, extends to peasants, um, women, and but also children. Romanticism, in a lot of ways, invented our modern conception of childhood. Um, and in a poem like We Are Seven, we can see how what's at stake there in this dialogue with the foreign perspective of the child is a conception of community. You know what? How family um, gets delineated, family bonds, um, what the limits are. Um, the speaker in this poem is invested in a kind of empirical rationality, which so he insists that the dead they don't count. I mean, this is so much about the our contemporary issue of who counts, who matters. He's saying um, the dead don't count. They don't matter. They're not there. They can't be counted. Um, and the he's um, um, resisted by the perspective of the girl who does count them and has represents a different different measure, just like I was talking about in to my sister, different um, uh, means of counting, which is also a refrain. It's a poem. It's not just she's not just asserting her imagination against the rational objectivity of the man, but her music. Um, so I thought I mentioned before. I think it's very pointed. Not only does the man not count her deceased siblings, he doesn't count the words. It was throwing words away. He doesn't count um, the language. Um, uh, that's to say, family bond is bound up with, or family language is that family bond. Language, when I say the body, poetry is the body language of language, that body is family. Or in the the basic term of romantic social bonds, friendship, social bonds woven by this are woven poetically. Um, these key romantic texts, Nutting, Kubla Khan, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and Frankenstein too, all explore this creation of social bonds um, through interwoven imagination and language, um, in contrast to the motif of hunting. Um, a lot of Frankenstein is about, hunting down the creature. But hunting in general, it is a figure for the suspension of that um, poetic interplay of identity and difference. It just hunting is like consumption. It just turns identity. It consumes difference and makes it a part of identity. That's how it's explored in these poems. I think I'm just trying to explain the motif of hunting and why it's so prominent. And although this isn't explicitly about hunting, I think you can see how that same process of uh, erasing difference in the perspective of the speaker, the old man and the older man in this uh, wants to eliminate the not just the reality of the dead siblings, but words of the child. Um, and The speaker in We Are Seven wants to subsume the otherness of the girl, the alterity of her perspective. He wants to subsume under the identity of his objective rationality. Um, so let's start with looking at nutting. And, you know, different reproductive norms are at stake there, different ideas of social belonging, social counting. Um, so this is, like the prelude spoken from the perspective of Wordsworth autobiography. And he's remembering going out hunting himself, or going after nuts. And you can see he emphasizes a kind of boyish or childish imagination in his costuming. He's playing the role. He's playing. He's imitating a hunter. That's another kind of poetic aspect of children. He's acting out the role of the hunter rather than just serving the purpose, the kind of mechanical purpose of conquest and consumption. And then I'm just going to read through it because it's I think really powerful piece of writing, but I just want to draw your attention to the subtext of sex that he, like in Kubla Khan, these are thinly disguised poems about a kind of sexual arousal and climax, and juxtaposing the desire for conquest with the kind of erotic blurring of the boundaries of oneself and the other. So sexuality on the one hand as dissolving the subject, and sexuality on the other hand is another example of hunting and conquest and consumption being juxtaposed. And what's interesting in these three cases is that the assertion of self, the assertion of the conquest, the hunter imposing his identity and consuming the other, leaves the subject feeling hollow, actually less expressive, less creative, more disoriented. They, in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, famously, there's no motive for killing the albatross. The will to conquest is presented in these three cases as a inane mechanical compulsion, whereas the erotic dissolving in the environment or in the other is shown to be very creative and expressive, interactive. And something else to notice about sort of character. The character is, or agency is, more expressive and creative in a collective or in a relationship than it is isolated as a supposed character, supposed integral individual will. Um, okay, so here the boy, full of grand fantasies of romantic adventure, heads off into the woods with motley accoutrement, funny, overdressed, of power to smile at thorns and brakes and brambles, and in truth more ragged than need was. O'er pathless rocks, through beds of matted fern and tangled thickets, forcing my way, I came to one dear nook unvisited, where not a broken bough drooped with its withered leaves, ungracious sign of devastation. But the hazels rose tall and erect, with tempting clusters hung, a virgin scene. A little while I stood, breathing with such suppression of the heart as joy delights in, and with wise restraint voluptuous, fearless of arrival, eyed the banquet. Or beneath the trees I sate, among the flowers, and with the flowers I played, a temper known to those who after long and weary expectation have been blessed with sudden happiness beyond all hope. Perhaps it was a bower beneath whose leaves the violets of 5 seasons reappear and fade, unseen by any human eye, where fairy water breaks do murmur on forever. And I saw the sparkling foam, and with my cheek on one of those green stones that fleeced with moss under the shady trees, lay round me scattered like a flock of sheep, I heard the murmur and the murmuring sound, in that sweet mood when pleasure loves to pay tribute to ease, and of its joy secure, the heart luxuriates with indifferent things, wasting its kindliness on stocks and stones and on the vacant air. Then up I rose and dragged to earth both branch and bough with crash and merciless ravage, and the shady nook of hazels and the green and mossy bower, deformed and sullied, patiently gave up their quiet being. And, unless I now confound my present feelings with the past, ere from the mutilated bower I turned, exulting, rich beyond the wealth of kings, I felt a sense of pain when I beheld the silent trees and saw the intruding sky. Then, dearest maiden, move along these shades in gentleness of heart, with gentle hand touch, for there's a spirit in the woods. Only at the end do we realize this whole poem has been a conversation with a girl. It's a confession, maybe, sort of an opposite of We Are Seven, acknowledging the spirit that the hunting compulsion had violated, ravaged. Notice all, I feel like this scene of kind of erotic interaction, resonance in nature is one of Wordsworth's best. Just notice all the conceptual contradictions, the narrative loss of the narrative thread. Perhaps it was this, perhaps it was that. The restraint voluptuous, a suppression as joy delights in. These paradoxically defined emotional and states. And this line I've mentioned before, I heard the murmur and the murmuring sound, what's the difference between those? It's turning perception of objective perception into a rhythm. The murmur, I hear the murmur, and the murmuring sound, with the sound, the experience that keeps happening beyond the word I've used to designate it. I've identified it, but it keeps slipping beyond my identification. And this slippage is the nature of pleasure, like that, this nothingness, this idleness, just the pleasure of the mind reflecting on itself. That sweet mood when pleasure loves to pay tribute to ease. Pleasure pays tribute to ease. And of its joy secure, the heart luxuriates with indifferent things, wasting its kindliness on stocks and stones and on the vacant air. That's the gift of the poem. He's giving us this waste, this wasted pleasure. That's waste on the one hand, like the girl in We Are Seven, totally marginal, totally not worth noticing or listening to, but on the other hand changes everything. Articulates a whole different world. What was marginal becomes the center. Kubla Khan is literally about the claim to own pleasure, to possess a dome of pleasure, to turn it into an object that one can own. And this first section of the poem is filled with images of containment, and yet it also signals the uncontainability of what would be contained. The caverns measureless to man. He's talking, all but explicitly about female sexuality, this famous opening line has a rhythm, chiasmic rhythm. It sort of unfolds back and forth like a mirror image. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan, goes in and out. The A and U sounds, enacting that environmental or sexual interaction, identity and difference, that's being sort of resisted by the narrative of the decree of the pleasure dome, trying to measure out what is measureless. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round. So the form of the poem moves from this scene setting and narrative premise to this encounter with the sublime, announced with the word "oh," this exclamation of what can't be properly stated, what is measureless. So how is sublimity evoked? What sort of sublime figures do you notice? What sort of figures for measurelessness, for infinity, do you notice? So this is, in a way, this middle section is Coleridge putting sexuality into poetry, measuring, giving a poetic measure to sexuality. I think what's powerful about it is it's precisely an image of slipping away of things, defying measure, overflowing. It builds to an orgasmic climax. which but like it's so did nutting builds to this climax, but that is revealed as a state of emptiness. What we thought was going to be absolute fulfillment turns out to be absolutely like hollow and emptying, disorienting. Um, uh, and this theme of male rivalry, ancestral voices prophesying war, um, and paranoia. I didn't get my conquest. Some other man is going to take it from me. Um, uh, Images. Epic similes. The complex images overflowing in their metaphors. The way he describes this Cedern cavern, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedern cover, a savage place, this is great, as holy and enchanted as e'er beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. So these endless, sort of like Blake's Sunflower, these metaphors that are recursive, keep spiraling into. It's like this place is as holy and enchanted as this other place beneath the waning moon was haunted by a woman wailing for her demon lover in some other place. The sublime is evoked by this endless measurelessness. What's haunted, what's holy, but it's all you can say is it's like this other haunted holy place. But what's that like? It's like this other one. It's just like the Blake's Sunflower. It's going to the place where there's the virgin and the youth. But where are they going? They're going to some other place. What is that place like? It's defined by going to this other place. So this interactive motion, music, climaxes in this tumult in which Kubla hears ancestral voices prophesying war. It's like, oh shit, I got it. And then it slips through my fingers and I'm totally empty-handed. And this is beautiful. I talked about the chiasmus of the opening line, of the sounds in the opening line. Here are a number of different, so it's a kind of post-sexual reflective state of noticing these inversions. So presence, absence, identity and difference. So the cave and the dome, the ice and the sun, and I think the miracle and the device, the machine and the miracle, the magic. He's talking about the relationship of the poetry, the measure, the technology of language, and what can't be said, what's measureless to man, the device and the miracle. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain in the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. It's surreal. He's talking about what was heard, where was heard out on the sea, this place where there's nobody to hear it. but he's evoking what would be heard there if there were someone. He's transmitting a dream of this interactivity of these uh, opposing, contrary images. Then he proceeds to talk about music. He's his own poetic overflow responds to music. This memory of this music. If I could hear this music again, I could write this poem, but he's just written. So you get the sense that the poem is an event, not something that's held fast or contained or possessed, as if in a pleasure dome. And then overflowing again, the paranoia again of his audience that would see this poetry in action. They would react with a poetry of fear, a poetry of paranoia, performing a kind of magic to counter the magic of pleasure. Beware, beware his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. So again, a kind of chiasmus, this gesture of containment opens and closes the overflowing with interior of the poem. So Kubla Khan juxtaposes the project of possession, containment within the pleasure dome, all the object of desire, in the terms of Blake's Sunflower, where the journey's done, the destination, the end point of all human striving, to make it contained somehow. It's like the ambition to contain truth in language. That is juxtaposed to this perpetual overflow. The way in which language evokes desire precisely by failing. It evokes, it communicates desire by showing its failure to contain it, and so hence the overflowing cascade. So language then becomes what we were talking about in Wittgenstein, this picture, the duck-rabbit illusion. Rather than a representation, this and that are represented, objects are represented, and I see that, and I name that in one way or another. That's a sort of passive recording of facts, registering, documenting. Coleridge is showing active, dynamic seeing as. See, this place, it's enchanted. It's enchanted like this other place where the woman is wailing under the moon for her demon lover that she imagines in some other place. Language becomes a symptom, of a emotion, a contagious symptom that you're infecting the reader with. It's not just a contagion, it's full of emotion. But the difference is between seeing language as communicating information, facts, language as more or less arbitrarily signaling information about the objective world. So I say stuff and you hear it, and then you know the information or the facts that were designated by my words. What I'm talking about here is communicating this ability to see as. That means communicating metaphors for experience. I'm sharing with you, that's what I meant by infecting. I'm sharing with you ways of framing experience that you wouldn't have otherwise. That's, I think that, that romantic theme of giving voice to otherwise unacknowledged, voiceless perspectives in society. Same can be said for experience in general, that this is communicating a way of framing, seeing as acting. It's making experience expressive. My seeing as is expressive of who I am, rather than passive. I'm just neutrally recording. Now I'm gonna have a little digression here, sort of inspired by this duck rabbit illusion, and talk about some more about that idea of the contrast between an organism defined by its physical body versus an organism defined by its communication. So that song, for instance, is a kind of interactions of bodies extending beyond themselves. I mean, that's what we're talking about in Kubla Khan, right? It's like the way in which our desires, emotions overflow ourselves and infect those around us. How our lives can't be contained, but are always overflowing and interacting. I find this just fascinating. This guy, Adolf Portman, wrote a book, 1930s or 40s, I think, called Animal Forms and Patterns. I think he's an early developer of kind of this idea of radical environmental interaction that we've been talking about in lots of different ways. Frost at Midnight, Blake, the sort of infinite intertwining of everything with everything else. So Portman made some fascinating observations and drew compelling conclusions in examining animal morphology, the forms of animal bodies. And what he noticed, which is kind of obvious if you think about it for a second, that animals remarkably, how I was talking about how much brain power is devoted to the capacity for music. That's true of animal expression in general. Animals put way more design, effort, evolutionary costs are borne by the exterior, the expression, the way in which the organism appears to the rest of the world and communicates. So, for instance, a lion and a tiger, totally different species. If you remove their skin, it's actually hard to tell them apart. Like just in terms of their internal organs. Um, this is, you think about it in terms of a bird's feather, like the the practical function of the bird's feather is one thing, but once you get to the tip of the feather is infinitely more complex, much more complex than structurally than the whole rest of the internal structure of the feather to produce this like iridescence that always only appears in the eyes of others, like it's there to be seen by others. um, that's what I'm talking about, this um, uh, evolutionary work and time that's gone into these intricate appearances of animals, the way in which they appear to their environment and to each other, goes contrary to our normal understanding of life, the identity of an organism is. We think our appearance serves reproduction of the organism, of the species. So that's to say, I am a particular organism. I have, particular capacities and appearances which I express in the world for the sake of reproductive success, passing my genes along. But if what we're so, in other words, the exterior serves the interior. But what Portman suggests is that we can look at it the other way around. That animals exist to be seen, to communicate. That is your identity, is the way in which you interact and communicate. And your reproduction, your just physical reproduction, that exists to serve communication. You reproduce yourself physically in order that you can communicate, interact in the world. And that's sort of a ontological distinction. Where my identity is my identity this thing, and I'm interacting in everything in order to preserve this thing? Or is my identity outside myself, created and recreated in my interaction and communication? And my organism, the physical aspect of my organism exists to serve that. I think when you put it that way, it's pretty hard to deny. I mean, this is a premise of Romanticism and German idealism, that it's your heart. What would it even mean if we exist, if we communicated in order to perpetuate our genes? Because even in saying that, we're communicating. It's impossible to escape the reality created by our interaction. That's where we live. This idea of some other reality that's true, unvarnished, objective, that our communication just designates, is, these philosophers, the romantic philosophers generally, it's sort of a legacy of religion, that we treat this other world. It's sort of what Blake, would say, the objective empirical world is this reality independent of us. But that is a creation of our own minds. And it's something we use to communicate, and it makes us very powerful. It allows us to develop technology and so on, and gives us a lot of power in the world. But it's a mistake. It limits our communication to treat that as somehow existing without us. Hence, Blake says in the Proverbs of Hell, nature without man is barren. Now, he doesn't say that because he thinks that without man, nature actually would be barren. He says it because he understands that what we mean when we say nature is an expression of who we are. We express ourselves through our language, our attempts to designate the outside world. Um, so we have to include ourselves in our own expression. We have to acknowledge our role in our own expression, and that's Blake's thing. Is if we treat it as the outside world as independent of us, that is barren. That is deadly. That is not fruitful. Um, our fruitfulness comes from our active role in not just communicating, but in thinking. Um, so that's what Shelley is, a principle that's near and dear to Shelley and basic to his uh, argument in the defense of poetry. As he says in the beginning of the second paragraph, poetry is connate with the origin of man. Um, we are tool using species. I mean, so that's nothing unique about us, but what is unique about us is the level of refinement of our tools and the degree to which we extend beyond ourselves through our tool use, especially the use of language. If a bird exists in the way its song is heard by other birds, its body extends into its song and the interactions of songs. That's true of us. That's what I was trying to suggest in talking about the role of music in the origin of language. But beyond that, not just the sound, but the ideas. Ideas are like echoes of the sound in the mind. We are how we not just are heard by each other, but recognized as meaningful. These meanings are like echoes of our sound. Um, uh, um, we Our sounds communicate emotion, bodily states, and they communicate ideas and meanings that and formal relationships, like those metaphors, seeing as. It's a whole matrix of material and mind that's communicated. Um, and I think that's really beautiful to think about language as, or meanings as extensions, sort of echoes of the physical, material properties of language. Um, that's certainly, I think, what Wordsworth is getting at in a line like the hearing the murmur and the murmuring sound. He's the language, that repetition is evoking the activity of mental reflection. So the murmur is the mind trying to represent the sound, and the murmuring sound is the evocation of the kind of experience of ongoing perception and interaction in the world. This idea of seeing as words, a line like that, in its rhythmic organization, its formal properties, it communicates to the reader a kind of action. Not just it doesn't just communicate an object, describe an experience, but it like music, it communicates a form of action in the world, a way of organizing experience actively. So there's a key theatrical dimension to romantic poetry, to all this irony. We're seeing the writer in action. The putting the language together is what we do when we put our experience together as we go through life. Um, so it's that's what I meant by sort of offering to infect us. He's inciting us to a kind of imitation of this way of organizing body and mind. Um, and I mean, I guess it's important to say that because otherwise it's hard to make any sense of it. I mean, it's just, if we're just relying on deciphering the meaning, it's totally redundant. Um, so here's how Shelley resorts to the metaphor of the Aeolian lyre that we also explored in Coleridge's poem of that name. Um, and that's his metaphor, seeing as, that's his metaphor for language, the way language works. Um, uh, it's a communication of uh, an echo, um, sort of an infectious echo. Yeah, I guess that's what echoes are, inviting the receivers, those who hear, to receive that echo. That's why Wordsworth described experience as half created, half received. We're always, I mean, that's that identity and difference. So poetry is connate with the origin of man. So again, we're born in our language. Man is an instrument over which a series of external and internal impressions are driven, like the alternations of an ever-changing wind over an Aeolian lyre, which move it by their motion to ever-changing melody. But there's a principle within the human being, and perhaps within all sentient beings, which acts otherwise than the lyre and produces not melody alone, but harmony. We resonate, we actively respond. We don't just passively echo, but interactively harmonize. By an internal adjustment of the sounds or motions thus excited to the impressions which excite them. It's as if the lyre could accommodate its chords to the emotions of that which strikes them in a determined proportion of sound, even as the musician can accommodate his voice to the sound of the lyre. This is a key passage. A child at play by itself will express its delight by its voice and motions, and every inflection of tone and every gesture will bear exact relation to a corresponding antitype in the pleasurable impressions which awakened it. It will be the reflected image of that impression. And as the lyre trembles and sounds after the wind has died away, so the child seeks, by prolonging in its voice and motions the duration of the effect, to prolong also a consciousness of the cause. In relation to the objects which delight a child, these expressions are what poetry is to higher objects. So I think what he's saying there is akin to what that ontological distinction I was making before, that our being exists in our communication, our interaction. We tend to think we have an essentialist bias. This is something else, it's a psychological fact about us. And I actually think this essentialist bias actually indicates how invested we are in communication. It's because we put so much value and trust in social consensus that we treat the objective world, what's socially recognized as objective, as unquestionable and essential, that like each thing is defined by some kind of internal essence. And so that we see each fact. But what Shelley's emphasizing here is that we see as that the feeling that the child expresses is actually embedded in that expression. What that feeling is that expression. The expression modifies it, harmonizes with it, it forms it in a certain way. And Shelley says it prolongs the feeling, communicates the feeling. This has to do with why romantics emphasize pleasure so much, the pleasure of poetry, because the point of poetry is itself, is the experience of itself, not representing anything outside itself. But that pleasure is what's informative. The communication, the pleasure in representing feeling, and communicating it, is what defines it, is what defines who we are. Just, like birdsong. Here's a funny cartoon about the social definition, functional definition of animals, creatures, that you exist in how you express and communicate yourself with the outside world. It's a little story. Animals are ruining my life. Have you ever noticed how enthusiastic animals are about the morning? Here's a funny cartoon about how social animals are, how much of what it means to be an animal is in how it expresses and communicates itself with other animals. Shelley was a great animal lover. One of the sort of early modern advocates of vegetarianism. You saw in that passage his awareness of the poetry, maybe not just about humans but all sentient creatures. So in that passage about the child, the way in which the child doesn't just perpetuate its joy in the sounds it makes to express it, but reforms it, recreates it. It becomes a cause in itself. The being is embedded in the language, in the communication. So Shelley is saying, I'd like to suggest we humans should become more like the animals in this respect. So this is a funny little story. Animals are ruining my life. Have you ever noticed how enthusiastic animals are about the morning? They wake up and start running around making noise for no reason. They're all, holy crap, I'm an animal and it's really fucking early in the morning and I feel great. I haven't slept more than 5 hours in a night over a week now, and it's all because of one stupid bird that lives in a tree right outside my window. Here's a really shitty picture I drew of my house and the tree and the bird. This arrangement is a problem because I'm nocturnal. I go to bed about 4 a.m. and the bird wakes up 3 hours later and starts making sounds like an alarm clock because it's so excited to be a bird. I'm a bird, I'm a bird, I'm a bird. The bird wakes up every other animal in the world, and then all the animals are like, yay, we're animals and it's morning. I'm a dog, yeah, I'm a motherfucking squirrel. Holy crap, I'm a horse. It's completely unnecessary. Sometimes I try to yell at them to get them to be quiet, but they're all animals, so they don't listen to you at all. So I think that's interesting. You can ask the question two ways. Like, what would you say if you're just like, I'm me? What is that? What would I think that's, Shelley would say that's what we're always doing. Language is always an affirmation of ourselves, just like these animals. Like, that I am me. That's what we're always saying, whatever else we're saying in language. It's always, we're representing ourselves as the speakers. We're representing our voice. And just affirming it, and spreading that affirmation to each other. It's a social affirmation, caring about communicating. That investment in communication is a kind of reproduction of the species. And so, on the one hand, you could say everything we say is, is saying what we're about. But looking at it the other way around, I think, the privilege of proper poetry for Shelley, everything is poetry because everything is creative and expressive of our world. But proper poetry may be especially so because it's the most useless otherwise. Again, that idea of idleness.